Back from the dead.
Welcome to my guide to Melee Brother builds for the Battle Brothers Legends mod. I'm the Indomitable Snowman, and hopefully this video can help you with your playthroughs of the Legends mod. Just before we start, I've got a couple quick intro things to help make this video easier to follow. Firstly, the basic disclaimer that these builds are all my own personal opinion and playstyle for this mod, so if you feel as though your builds are better or suit your playstyle more, that's perfectly okay. However, I've played this mod and found these builds to be pretty reliable, and some are just fantastic. And some builds have succeeded in previous versions of the mod too. But it almost goes without saying that you need good stats to make good builds, so we'll also touch on that. If you've watched my playthroughs, you will already know our love-hate relationship with dynamic perks, and how it can be hard to make consistent builds with inconsistent perks. This video is designed to help you work with the random perk generation of dynamic perks. However, these builds still work even if you don't use dynamic perks. But the randomness of dynamic perks is always a problem, and no two playthroughs will ever be the same. Always remember to work with what you have and play to your strengths. A good example of this is choosing favorite enemy perks or building brothers around the free perk you get with most avatar and lone wolf type starts. When it comes to stats versus perks, I cannot deny that I value stats more. Mainly because you cannot have the best perk setup in the game, but if a brother misses every hit, he will be useless. If a brother only misses one or two perks, but has good enough stats to keep up, he will definitely perform well. However, it goes without saying that if you have both stats and perks, you're set up for success. Moving on to an important statement, the builds in this video are designed around essential perks which are the core of the build. If you don't have all the core perks for the build, it won't work very effectively. But if you only have these core perks, the build will still work fine. Recommended perks are very valuable perks to flesh out the build and make it stronger by supporting these core perks. Optional perks are there just in case you have a perk point to spend and didn't get lucky enough with recommended perks, or if you need to unlock a new tier of perks. Extra perk options also help if you get your brothers past level 11 and pick up more perk points. The final point I need to make is that all these builds and any future adjustments or iterations of them can be found on my personal spreadsheet that is linked in the description. Overall, I hope the spreadsheet and this video can help you with building brothers in your own playthroughs. Now, let's get into it. We'll be working on melee builds today, and the most important thing to make sure is you have good stats before committing to a late game build on your brothers. The main thing to look on melee brothers is high melee attack and melee defense, stats, and stars. If you're not used to calculating the stats of your brothers, I suggest checking out the wiki to help you get used to leveling up and how stats work. For frontline brothers, melee attack is an obviously important stat, as well as melee defense, and the easiest way to work out how much you need is at level 1 having a rough melee attack of about 50 with 3 stars, 55 with 2 stars, 60 with 1, and 65 with 0 stars will get you on average to that 85 that you need as a minimum. With melee defense, it's a lot easier to get usually, and stars really help you there. Whereas you can get 0 melee defense with 1 star to a rough 25 melee defense. I usually aim for higher than 85 and 25 because of how bad my luck is with RNG. And if my brothers roll low, it's still better to aim higher and they can get to that mark if they roll low. And also, I just love having the highest number of stats for brothers because that just makes them perform that much better. I personally rate melee defense as the best stat, and also the hardest stat to get on brothers. So even if they have a little bit weaker attack but good defense, I'll still take them on board because that's what they need to stay alive. 50 resolve is a must-have on all frontline brothers. Even more can be better because it'll help when you get surrounded and have constant morale checks on the front lines. 70 health is a good benchmark for all frontline brothers as well, to help them not get one-shot by crossbows and to help in general when taking multiple hits. Now, let's jump into our first build. Two-handed builds only require high melee attack and melee defense, hopefully with stars to get you there. Since we're building for one big hit a turn, we don't need hardly any fatigue at all, but roughly 30 or so fatigue will help us move and attack each turn. Right, so the basic two-handed build is technically an economy build that isn't usually too hard to make, and the stats aren't usually too hard to find as well. Pathfinder is sometimes hard to get, but it really helps us not get bogged down on terrain and helps us manage our low fatigue. Clarity is a very important perk in this build, as it allows us to move twice and hit each turn. The extra 1 movement space makes a notable difference, and it pairs well with Pathfinder. Quick Hands is also very important, as it allows us to hold a reach weapon and to switch to it if we aren't close enough to the enemy to help us keep attacking every turn. Brawny and Battleforged is usually the go-to when you take this build, but this brother doesn't have that, and Nimble is still very good as a defensive and allows you to have a little bit extra fatigue if you're struggling there. Weapon Mastery is also a must-have, but not all weapons work with this build. Two-handed spears and cleavers specifically only attack twice a turn and will make you run out of stamina, so two-handed flails, maces, hammers, axes, and swords are the ones to go for in this build. Finally, that little star at the bottom there reminds us that Rebound is a much needed perk, so you can swing heavy late-game orc and barbarian weapons. Unfortunately, this brother did not roll very well on many of the nice recommended perks. However, Underdog is amazing and always a good pick on your frontline brothers. Assured Conquest is a little situational, but very beneficial if you can keep up your brother's confidence. With the last 2 perk points available to us, we'll take Balance for the free 5% in defense, and we'll also take Anticipation to help us not get targeted or take less arrows to the face while sitting on the front line. Our next build is one of the strongest yet hardest builds to make on a melee brother, requiring high melee attack and defense, but very high resolve. The Mind Over Body two-handed sword build needs some high stats, mainly that 100 resolve, as it aims to reduce the fatigue cost of the AoE attack on the two-handed swords to be able to swing against multiple enemies every turn. Looking at the essential perks, you can also see that it needs some pretty hard to get perks alongside those high stats. This brother here is the one we had in our assassin playthrough. He still performed amazingly and decimated enemies whilst not having access to all the core perks needed to finish this build properly, so there's still hope in case you don't have all the perks for this build. Now, this build is an upgrade to the previous two-hander build, keeping the beneficial Pathfinder, Clarity, Nimble, or Battleforged, and a weapon spec. The main difference is the focus on the 100 resolve allows us to utilize Mind Over Body, and Fortified Mind almost always is needed to help us get there. Forceful Swing and Bloody Harvest give the much needed 10% accuracy and damage when hitting those sword AoE attacks. And lastly, Rebound, which this brother also didn't roll on, is needed to help keep you swinging every turn, and is even more important if you can't get high enough resolve to reduce your fatigue costs. Now, normally this build requires 9 core perks, which is insane, but many times you will not be able to get them all, so sometimes you'll have to go with recommended perks to flesh out the build. As you know, I'm a sucker for Student and Gifted, and I take them when possible. Colossus is a big boon for anybody on the front lines, and for big damage builds like this one, Double Strike is one of the best damage buffs you can add to the build. Optional perks for this build will almost always be ignored, but they're here if you need them when you get to high levels. On to build 3. The Duelist build naturally needs high melee attack and defense, but it's the opposite of two-hander builds, as it desperately needs stamina in order to keep attacking as often as possible. The Duelist build is deceptively economical, because the perks can sometimes be hard to get altogether. But basically, you just need Recover and a high fatigue pool to help keep you swinging every turn. You'll need a weapon spec for that sweet fatigue reduction, and you can pick almost any melee weapon available, just not polearms, fists, or daggers, because it doesn't work with Duelist. Now, we picked the Duelist perk because that's the main part of the build, and because you're going to be able to punch through armor very well with it. Nimble is there because you can't use Battleforged and heavy armor with this build, as it'll cripple your fatigue pool and your fatigue regeneration there. Finally, you can choose Clarity or Berserk because both are good but serve different roles. Berserk helps you if you're constantly killing, and Clarity helps give you that extra movement to be able to rush the enemy, or it allows you to move one tile and still be able to attack twice a turn. With the recommended perks, you mainly focus on damage or defense, as you're not using a shield with this build. Student and Gifted, you already know, are great. Double Strike is devastating as always. Killing Frenzy is just another one of those all-around good damage buffs as long as you're killing every other turn. Underdog is always a great defensive. And finally, Lithe is pretty good here and should be taken when you have a lot of melee defense to make it even stronger. As usual, we didn't have to dip into the optionals, as we were able to grab all the stronger recommended perks. Next up is another one of our harder to make builds that can also dish out some really good damage. The Fencer Duelist also naturally needs high melee attack and defense, but this time requires maximum initiative in order to be effective, and thus this build is hard to make even just looking at the stats. The Fencer Duelist is the upgraded version of the previous Duelist build, but only uses fencing swords. This build focuses on the unique fencing lunge attack where its damage scales with initiative. We still use the same perks from our normal Duelist build, Recover, Nimble, and Duelist. One-handed sword mastery helps reduce fatigue, and as usual, we can take Berserk or Clarity depending on how we feel. With such a high initiative, we can now utilize the Dodge perk for more defense, and we can also grab Relentless to help keep our initiative as high as possible to utilize dodge and our maximum attack with lunging. Now, this build isn't as economic as a normal Duelist build and needs 7 perks to work well, but it still allows us to have a little bit of room for a few recommended perks as well. Student and Gifted as usual, alongside the nice defensive Underdog, are very good picks. Lithe here in this build is very strong, one of the strongest ways to use Lithe, because you'll be having quite the high melee defense when you're using dodge. No space as usual for optional perks, but they're there if you need them. Our next build keeps up with the trend of needing high fatigue to function well. The Cleaver/Whip build can either be played as a Duelist build or as a two-handed Cleaver build, mainly depending on the perks available to you and the weapons you pick up. The Cleaver Whip build is built almost identically to the Duelist build with using Recover, Weapon Mastery, and Nimble. Clarity is preferred over Berserk though, but either of them can work. However, the main difference in this build is that it desperately requires quick hands to be effective, mainly because you'll be using the whip to disarm enemies at range whenever you're not attacking, or whenever you need it. Now, Clarity gives you 2 disarms per turn, and Quick Hands does save you that valuable time if you desperately need a disarm right away. This build is not as economic as a general Duelist build, but if you can find all the perks and stats, it does add some well-needed utility alongside some good damage. Due to only needing 5 core perks, this build allows for some versatility with recommended perks. Seeing as you'll want your disarm to hit consistently, it can be good to maximize accuracy and stats with this build. Student and Gifted are great for that, while Backstabber is amazing, and will work for the whip attack and disarm at range, especially since you're most likely going to have other brothers around whilst you're trying to disarm. Colossus is a staple frontline build, as you will still be on the frontline with the Cleaver. Underdog is good when you go into melee, and again, Double Strike is awesome, but unfortunately, if you're disarming more often than attacking, it can be wasted on the disarm. So maybe another perk might be better for you, but see how you go. Once again, not much space for optionals, but it's always good to use the better recommended perks instead. Continuing on with the whip builds, the Banner Whip build is probably the best and most useful banner build you can make. This build only really needs a crazy high resolve, but you'd be surprised on how hard it is to get just one strong stat alongside all the perks we'll need. But when made, this build is good indeed. This build focuses on having high resolve to have a functional and effective rallying banner, whilst also allowing him to have a bit more utility in combat with the whip disarm, as a banner normally hangs back in fights and isn't super effective anyways. Recover is 100% must here, as every skill you use will drain your fatigue immensely in this build. Rally is a staple on banners to work against ghosts and help against bad morale checks. Fortified Mind is greatly needed to boost your resolve to our minimum 100 level. Nimble is highly preferred because it gives us a better fatigue pool, and it allows us to survive any lucky arrow shots that hit us. Mind Over Body is the bonus core perk that really helps reduce your fatigue costs. If you can get Mind Over Body in this build, definitely grab it. Cleaver Mastery gives a 15% accuracy to your disarm, and it helps reduce fatigue costs whilst you're disarming enemies. Finally, Quick Hands makes the whip usable in battle whilst letting you re-equip your banner and keep the resolve up 24/7. Inspiring Presence is just a basic on banners. To be able to give your guys confident at the beginning of a battle, it's always nice on high resolve builds. But you should only really just keep it on one person at a time. With such a heavy 8-core perk build, you are already used to the reduced number of perks that we can play around with. Student and Gifted are great as usual. Clarity is a nice pickup on this build as it allows you to disarm twice a turn if the situation needs it. However, other options are always still viable as well. As usual, options will almost never be touched on an 8-core perk build. Now, our next build allows us to build a banner if you aren't lucky enough to get the high stat and perk requirement for the previous banner whip build. This banner is the bare minimum banner, which, as you can see, suggests a lesser stat requirement of 90 resolve with fortified mind and can still work well with 70 plus attack. The main goal of this build is to have somebody able to just use a banner and rally people. We've stripped the previous build to the absolute core perks you need on a banner. Recover is always a must for fatigue. Rally the troops is vital as well. Fortified Mind really helps you get to the high resolves. If you have high enough resolves without it, that's fine, but it's just there as a very good perk. Nimble is always preferred, but even if you're desperate, you can still go with Battleforge like this brother has here with Brawny, because it still works as a banner, even if you don't have the best resolve. Finally, it would be amazing if you can get Inspiring Presence, because it is so strong to have your brothers confident at the beginning of the battle. But since Inspiring Presence isn't the most important core perk in this pack, if you can't get it, don't be too disappointed. With the recommended perks here, try and focus where your banner is lacking. Stats are always good because that's probably where your banner is lacking, with the Student and Gifted being very strong choices. Backstabber is the best choice though. It really helps with your low attack and allows you to be able to hit something on your turn. Clarity is a very nice addition. It allows you to move around and helps you to get to save any brothers that need it. Now finally, Inspire is amazing. I really love putting this gem of a perk on our weaker banners because it allows them to spend their turn to give more action points to the people who are stronger in our party and can make a bigger difference. So I definitely enjoy it. With the economy banner and how weak and unlucky you may get, the optional perks just might help you in this build. I'd say Feint is probably the stronger choice because it helps you if you miss and give your other brothers a better chance to hit. And yeah, it is good. We'll now move on to our dedicated backline build, the Polearm build. This build allows us to use brothers that have high attack but no other good stat. As long as they can use polearms, they're more than viable for your team. The polearm build is usually easy to make and is quite economical. The build revolves around the action point reduction from Polearm Mastery and the increased action point from Clarity to help you attack twice a turn with a polearm. Recover is almost a must, as you will stam out from attacking twice a turn, but if you roll even half decent on your resolve, you can change up the build and use Mind Over Body with Rebound and never have to worry about fatigue again. As long as you can get your attack fatigue down from 12 per hit to 10 per hit, you can utilize Mind Over Body and Rebound. As usual, Nimble is the preferred defensive to be able to use lighter armor to help your fatigue as high as possible. As this build is very economical most times, you'll have a lot of flexibility to add as much damage as possible, as you can usually delete people with 2 attacks with this build. Student and Gifted help you with good stats. Backstabber is the best monster-free stats, as you'll almost always hit with somebody in front of you. This build can do okay in melee, but if you get jumped, but try not to stay in melee too often because we're not building defense on this build. Double Strike is absolutely amazing on this build, and you can constantly one-shot, two-shot people with it. Lithe is alright, but it's usually better on defensive builds, but it's still a good 30% chance. Assured Conquest gives a nice 10% boost to accuracy if you need more accuracy, and is good if you can upkeep your confidence. And finally, with all the killing you'll be doing from a safe distance, Killing Frenzy is a great pickup indeed. Out of all the optionals, the best choice is probably Anticipation, to help you with your lack of defense, and to help you not be such a pincushion. You can take it over a recommended perk if you're facing a lot of ranged enemies. Now, just a final side note for this build, we've had a brother in our Assassin's playthrough get traumatized early on and take a permanent injury, basically giving him the death sentence. But because of how economical this 4-core perk build is, we were able to convert him to a Polearm brother, and he was still able to dominate in our back ranks. So this build is definitely a viable backup build for any brother that gets their defenses or resolve destroyed by a permanent injury. The Dagger puncture build is an experimental build that is rather situational, so I'd only recommend this if you want to have fun, because it's not really the best build to take. It tries to work around the nerfed puncture attack and still make it viable. In order to do this, we have to treat the build like a duelist build stat-wise, and grab a lot of fatigue. The build is simple and economical in design, but the execution's the tricky part. You can do a dagger build 2 different ways, but I recommend the grapple build. Focusing on holding a dagger with no offhand, you'll start the fight with the grapple and then puncture the enemy twice at 95% to hit. And since the grapple lasts 2 turns, you can puncture 3 more times the next turn at 95% to hit as well. With perks, you'll definitely need Recover to work on the fatigue because you're going to drain it insanely quickly. Clarity is a must because you can't get that extra attack in without it. And Dagger Mastery gives you that AP reduction to allow you to get those hits as well. Nimble gives us the best fatigue pool possible and a very good defensive. Finally, the last puncture perk that allows us to do well is Grappling. We base it mainly around that because it gives us the ability to hit puncture at 95%. Now, there's another choice that you can have if you want. You can try going with Mace Mastery instead, which allows you to get some stuns on enemies instead of just going for pure damage, but it's really up to you. But going with just the pure dagger build, you just need grappling with no offhand. Another cool option that you can get is if you get a really good amount of resolve on this character, you can go with Terrifying Visage, Fearsome, and Mind Over Body. And if you do that, you can make enemies morale check every time you hit them and get insane panic amongst all the enemies. It also can help with fatigue costs with the Mind Over Body if you get a good fatigue with high resolve. Now, since this is a more experimental economy build, you will have a lot of freedom of choice when choosing recommended perks. Accuracy is the only important one that you really need to worry about. So you really try and hit grapple with the accuracy. But if you're hitting your grapples pretty often, you really want to go for a bit more damage. Now, you go for Backstabber to give you the best chance to hit somebody. Gifted and Student are pretty good as well, but we don't have that on this character. So we're going to go with an Colossus to give you some nice defense, whilst being in the front line. Underdog and Lithe are very nice as well, whilst you're putting enemies in headlocks every turn. And mainly, though, you really want to try and aim for a double strike or some sort of extra damage because puncture damage isn't that strong, and you want to try and reduce the number it hits to take to kill someone, and therefore you don't have to worry about running out of fatigue. Now, optionals in this build won't be that useful, but there is one exception that you could use. Crippling Strikes paired with Executioner may be really useful. Because you're doing HP damage every turn, you will be able to injure very easily if you run Crippling and Executioner, and it allows you to get a permanent 20% damage buff against the people that you do injure for the rest of their life. So I'd almost be happy to make them recommended builds, recommended perks for the build, but we didn't really have space for it. Now, we find ourselves with the most important and valuable build available to melee brothers. The Mega Tank is an immovable object that will hold back and handle almost anything thrown at it. The stat and perk requirement is very high, so making an effective Mega Tank can be very hard and should be kept alive early game as best as possible if you do get one. Ultimately, you will want 40 melee defense without a shield, as much health as possible, 60 plus resolve, and around 30 plus usable fatigue. But as always, more is always better and very welcome, especially in this build. Requiring a whopping 9 core perks to be at full effectiveness, the Mega Tank is a needy one. Ideally, you'll be wanting to run the heaviest armor you can find alongside a tower shield and a light spear to make enemies second guess whether they want to run from you. The perks of this build are as follows: Colossus for the health, Brawny for the fatigue, and Battleforge to benefit even more from the heavy armor you're going to be wearing. Rebound lets you shield wall every turn without fail. It is an absolute must. Composure and Stalwart for those lovely stun and movement immunities. You can go Indomitable, but I don't recommend it because it needs more fatigue to activate, and you're wasting that on your turn instead of shield walling every turn. So if you can get the immunities, it is a lot better to grab those. Shield Mastery is a wonderful boost to defense, and you can never have enough defense on a tank. Underdog is more important on this build than any other frontliner you will have in your party, as you will almost always have your mega tank surrounded, holding off the masses. Finally, Taunt is a great perk to finish the build off. As you can see, this brother is not lucky enough to have all the perks we need, and if you're missing Taunt, it's not the end of the world, as you can just focus on having good positioning with all your brothers. However, Taunt can be a lightsaber, and is good to have in your back pocket if you ever get into bad positions. Now, with very limited versatility to this build, just add the most important perk you need. Since we're missing Taunt, we can add another recommended. Clarity is a very useful perk for mega tanks as it allows them to get further and move that extra one tile of movement to rush towards enemies or move towards the bigger threats. Pathfinder is another big helpful perk that helps you with clarity, but we don't have that on this guy, so we're going to take the Steel Brow for a little bit more defensibility in case they get lucky hits on our head. Now for the anticlimactic final build on our list, the Fodder and Weak Brother build. If you guessed it, then kudos to you. We will now touch on the more crappy brothers in your party, stricken by bad stats, bad rolls, permanent injuries, or lack of perks. This build will help you keep those brothers around as long as possible to maximize their remaining life in your company. The minimum stats there are as a guide to show you what to focus on. Melee defense and resolve are the big ones. Without these, they will not last more than 1 or 2 battles. Surprise, there's no core perks. Well, of course there isn't. You will not willingly want to build fodder builds for your brothers and expect them to stick around for long. Regardless, you'll be wanting to stock these weak brothers up with a good shield, good armor to prolong their death, and a spear to allow them to possibly hit things and keep enemies from disengaging so easily. Recommended perks here are all about survivability, with a little bit of focus on stats and accuracy. Notably, it's a very good choice to put Rotate on your weak brothers to save anyone important from bad situations by sacrificing yourself instead. 9 lives is amazing, and not just for fodder brothers, because with the Blazing Deserts expansion they have buffed 9 lives now, so it removes all damage over time effects and even gives you a defensive boost till your next turn. Shield Mastery here is an obvious choice, and Underdog is good too. Colossus and health in general is just a good thing to grab on weak brothers for sure. Rebound lets you shield wall every turn, so you can stall out a flank with a brother for longer. Balance is good for its 5%, and every percent helps with keeping your weak brothers alive for that extra turn longer. Perks on this list that this brother doesn't have include Nimble and Battleforge, which are obviously good defensive choices. Lastly, Feint is a good perk that your weak brother will be able to use well because he will miss often, and it'll allow your other brothers to smash enemies more easily. Oh, and my usual go-to with Student is a trap when looking at the brothers that won't last long in your party. It is got waste of a perk. You should really focus on defensive perks instead of Student because it only really gets its best value at level 11, which will unlikely happen to these brothers. Optional perks are more likely going to be used on this build more than any other build because of how unlucky you can get with some brothers. The good old immunities are a nice choice to further strengthen a weak brother and allow them to hold a flank more successfully against things like orcs and unholds. All the other optionals here are good too, and you will just have to choose what you need for your situation. Just before we go to the final notes, I want to put all the builds side by side and rate them, mainly because different builds will perform better than others in late game fights. Hopefully you already saw this in advance, but the Fodder weak build is not one you want to make on purpose. It is solely there to help with bad brothers and hopefully make them worth a bit more money than you paid them. I also cannot recommend the Dagger build because if you have the stats needed for the build, you almost always make a better build with those stats. That said, it's a gimmicky fun build that you can still enjoy sometimes. The bare minimum banner is a build that can last you to late game, but I would still prefer a better banner to make a build with. Moving on to the good builds, the two-hander, one attack per turn builds are very reliable and will always be a good addition to the party even if missing a core perk or two. Duelists are even more economic than two-handers and still provide good damage roll to late game, but can be harder to make because you need a lot of fatigue. Cleaver whips also need that high fatigue, and they allow to add a bit more disarm utility to an already strong damaging weapon. Banner whips provide the same great utility to a roll that is forced to use a banner, and the perks we have in that build make it a little hard to perfectly build, but it's quite rewarding when made. The final 3 superstar builds are the hardest to make, but also the most rewarding builds on this list. The two-handed sword mind over body build just steamrolls through enemies. Being able to use an AoE attack every turn is way too strong, and even just one of these builds that you have in your team will carry your party through late game. Fencer duelists are amazing to dash around the battlefield and shine when they can constantly lunge every turn. But do watch out for nomads and nets, because if you have your dodge ruined, you are going to be in for a world of pain. At last, but not certainly least, the Mega Tank is the largest cornerstone build that can put a party on its back. The ability to stonewall the enemy flanks or front lines or even champions is an invaluable ability that this build allows. When built to completion, this build can easily hold off orcs and unholds that is definitely not something an ordinary brother can do. Overall, make sure you have good stats, build your brothers accordingly, and pray you get good perk rolls. Now just some final closing notes to keep in the back of your mind. Don't forget the Legends mod is still in beta, and just like the most recent update, perk changes can happen which may open or close doors to these builds. However, the core essential perks in these builds will most likely not change. Please do check out my other guides and builds. If this video helps, hopefully my other ones will too. When playing Battle Brothers, nothing is ever simple and static. Cookie cutter builds will not succeed every time you play the game. So make sure you try your own builds every now and again, and remember to build for the situation you're playing in. But most importantly, remember to have fun. Max-minning stats and perfecting builds isn't everyone's cup of tea, and just like me, at the end of the day, you're here to have fun. Finally, don't forget that my spreadsheet has all this info on it, so you can easily access the builds at any time and be able to keep up with any changes I make in the future. Many thanks for watching till the end. I hope I've been able to help, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!